President Abraham Lincoln said, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." During the Civil War, Kentucky was an important border state that was heavily fought over by both North and South. The state supplied thousands of men for both sides, and a few key battles determined its fate. Many have said that if the Union had lost Kentucky, then they would have eventually lost the war. It was that important to both sides' cause, and the Battle of Middle Creek was one of the major pivot points of the region. Men from here in Floyd County fought on both sides, fired volleys at each other, and engaged in hand-to-hand combat against one another. Can you imagine that? Hey everybody, this is Colonel Carson with Family Tree Nuts, and recently we visited the location of the Civil War Battle of Middle Creek in Prestonsburg, Kentucky. In this video, we will give you details before, during, and after the battle, while we show you the sites as they are today. We will also discuss many of the amazing accomplishments that many of these men had after serving in this battle. Here at Family Tree Nuts, we make history videos all over the United States and a few countries. So if you like these types of videos, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and click that bell so you get notifications as to when we post a new video. Also, don't forget to leave us a comment about what you think about this video, or tell us about your Civil War ancestors. We'd love to hear from you. You will see before the end of this video that this battle has a personal connection to my family. Now let's get back to the Civil War action. The Battle of Middle Creek happened early in the war on January the 10th, 1862, and one of the most noted facts about the battle is it is the only battle that was personally commanded by future President James A. Garfield, who was then a colonel. Garfield began to make a name for himself at this battle and went on to fight in important battles of Shiloh and Chickamauga. In order to understand the Battle of Middle Creek, we must first understand the backstory of what led to the battle. When the Civil War began, the Kentucky state politicians were torn as to which side to support, but soon men around the state acted. The election of 1861 sent a Unionist majority to Frankfort, and the new legislature voted to suppress the rebellion. The people of Kentucky were forced to decide which side they were on. Prominent secessionist men in eastern Kentucky, such as Jack May, Hiram Hawkins, Ezekiel Clay, James M. Thomas, Benjamin Desha, and others began to recruit men to form militia companies to fight for Southern independence. In September 1861, these men marched their units to link up in Prestonsburg at the Samuel May Farm, which was a 400-acre farm complete with a steam-powered grist mill. The house was built in 1817 and is the oldest house in Prestonsburg, and was built by Samuel May, the son of Revolutionary War veteran John May. Samuel was commissioned to build the county's first brick courthouse and served as a Kentucky state senator, where he was instrumental in improving the Mount Sterling Pound Gap Road, which today is US 460. He later died in the California Gold Rush. The new recruits camped all around the Samuel May house, and in late September, former United States Vice President John C. Breckinridge fled arrest in Lexington and passed through Prestonsburg on his way to southwestern Virginia. He stopped by the Samuel May farm and gave a morale-boosting speech to the new recruits. On October the 2nd, their swelling numbers prompted the leaders to draft a letter to Jefferson Davis, which stated the following: His Excellency, President Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, Sir, our legislature has betrayed us. We have marched with 1,000 men. Hundreds are gathering around our standard daily. We can have 5,000 men here in 2 weeks. We would most respectfully petition Your Excellency to send us immediately some experienced military man to command us and place us upon a footing to make ourselves available and furthering the cause of civil freedom in which we have enlisted and which we pledge our lives and sacred honor. The raising up of men into the thousands was encouraged to those who supported the Southern cause, but was alarming to those loyal to the Union. Colonel John Stuart Williams took command of the Confederate forces being formed. Williams was also known as Cerro Gordo Williams for his heroic actions in the Mexican-American War. The new Confederate troops began to disperse around the neighboring counties. Upon hearing what the Confederates were accomplishing at the Samuel May Farm, the Union decided to act with a strong force. The Big Sandy expedition began mid-September 1861 when Union Brigadier General William Bull Nelson received orders to organize a new brigade in Maysville, Kentucky to conduct an expedition into the Big Sandy Valley region to cease the Confederate recruiting. Over the next few months, Nelson's 5,500 troops split into two groups, one which pushed the Confederates out of Hazel Green, Kentucky, and the other to push the Confederates out of West Liberty, Kentucky. The two groups linked up in Salyersville, also known as Licking Station, and on October 31st, 1861, stepped off on the final phase to push the Confederates out of Kentucky entirely. On November the 7th, the Union troops met up with the remaining Confederates in between Prestonsburg and Piketon, now called Pikeville, and here the Battle of Ivy Mountain took place. Nelson had sent Colonel Joshua W. Sill to take the route along Johns Creek and get behind the Confederates in Pikeville and prevent their escape. Nelson led the remaining 3,600 men towards Pikeville down the old state road, which is today US 460. Heavy rains caused the road to be extremely muddy, and that forced the Union troops to march in a single file line. The advance guard was hit first. 4 men were killed and 13 were injured. The ill-equipped Confederates were firing old shotguns and muskets, and Nelson jumped on a large rock and shouted that if the Confederates could not hit him, they could not hit any of them either. The 21st Ohio Infantry flanked the Confederates on top of a hill and began to roll large boulders down on the rebels, causing them to scatter in all directions. As the Confederates retreated, they burned bridges and chopped down trees to impede the Union's pursuit. Colonel Williams made it to Pikeville and placed a rear guard to protect the retreat of the rebels to Pound Gap, Virginia. General Nelson made it to Pikeville and then halted because he believed he had accomplished his mission to push the Confederates out of Kentucky, and due to the lateness of the season and the Confederates' lack of supplies, a counterattack was unlikely. 2 weeks later, Nelson received orders to bring his troops back to Louisville. Colonel Williams was surprised and fully expected the Union troops to pursue him into Virginia, but after their evacuation from the area, he downplayed the Union victory, saying that Nelson had dispersed an unorganized and half-armed, barefooted squad that lacked everything but the will to fight. The Confederates were determined to hold on to their support in eastern Kentucky, and in mid-September, General Humphrey Marshall marched out of Wytheville through Pound Gap and occupied Pikeville, Prestonsburg, and Paintsville. Union Major General Don Carlos Buell got word of the Confederate activity and sent Colonel James A. Garfield to take command of the 18th Brigade of the Army of Ohio to permanently drive the Confederates out of the Big Sandy Valley. General Marshall was pushed back from Paintsville to Prestonsburg, where he thought he could ambush Colonel Craner's men coming from Salyersville. But Craner went to Paintsville and fell in behind Garfield to reinforce the battle later. Marshall set up his men on the ridges and hidden positions looking over the valley of Middle Creek. Garfield expected an ambush and sent scouts slowly into the valley to identify where the Confederate troops were. He sent his own personal guard of 10 cavalrymen to draw fire, and when they did, he determined that the enemy had the high ground. Later after the battle, Garfield wrote his wife a letter that included a map that he had sketched, which has been valuable for us to understand the battle today. Once Garfield knew the approximate positions of the enemy, he ordered his men to split into 3 groups and attack the ridge lines where the Confederates were set up to ambush the valley. Major Don A. Pardee's men were pinned down by rebel sharpshooters. About this same time, Colonel Craner arrived to link back up with the main force, and Garfield ordered him to reinforce Pardee. Garfield then ordered Lieutenant Colonel George W. Monroe to select 120 Kentuckians to charge up the hill and assault the rebel sharpshooters. This detachment was quickly pinned down by the sharpshooters when Monroe ordered the men to fix bayonets, and with loud yells they charged up the steep ridge to fierce combat of Kentuckian versus Kentuckian. Monroe's men caused the rebels to fall back and opened the line for Pardee and Craner to continue the advance. It is said that Monroe's charge likely determined the battle's outcome. The Confederates had artillery and the Union did not. This was thought to be an advantage for the rebels, but ended up almost worthless. The muddy conditions caused the guns and their support wagons to be very difficult to move. The artillery unit was formerly a militia unit from Nottoway County, Virginia, and their ammunition had likely been in storage for more than 20 years, which caused it to be faulty. The Confederate lines broke, and Marshall was forced to retreat and fall all the way back to Virginia and give the Union the victory in the battle. The Confederates never again had as much of a hold on Kentucky as they did before this battle. Despite over 3,000 men engaging in combat at the Battle of Middle Creek, the casualties were very small. Different numbers can be found different places. The Confederates had at least 12 killed and as many as 57 wounded. The Union had 3 men killed and reports of 18 to 24 wounded. One of the Union units that participated in the battle was the 14th Kentucky Infantry, which had 1 killed and 2 wounded. One of the 2 wounded was Private Thomas Jefferson Bellamy, who after the battle was sent by train to a hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. 3 days later, he passed away and is buried in Lexington Cemetery. He was my 4th great uncle, which makes this story very real to me. My 5th great-grandfather, Bennett Bellamy, was awarded a pension for his son's service and ultimate sacrifice. Thomas had mustered into service on December the 10th, 1861, just a month before he was wounded at this battle and eventually passed away. Just a month. Another interesting note is that my 3rd great-grandfather, Bernard Bellamy, who was 2 years old at the time of the 1860 census, lived in the same household as Thomas. Having photographs of people who knew someone that lived a story in history makes it incredibly more real. Now let's take a look at some of the other men of note that took part in the Battle of Middle Creek and their experiences after it. Many of these men went on to do amazing things, and it's interesting that they all have fighting in the Battle of Middle Creek in common. The first person we'll talk about is the Union commander, Colonel James Garfield, who was born to modest beginnings in a log cabin near Cleveland, Ohio. He wanted to be a teacher and graduated from Williams College before becoming a Latin and Greek professor at Hiram College. He was an ardent abolitionist, and in 1859 he became an Ohio State Senator. When the war broke out, Ohio Governor Dennison appointed Garfield a colonel and asked him to raise up a regiment. After his victory at Middle Creek, Garfield was promoted to brigadier general and had much more success in the war. He used his popularity to rise in political ranks, eventually being elected the 20th President of the United States in 1880. A little more than 6 months into his office, he was assassinated. He was only 49 years old. Garfield's Confederate counterpart in the battle was Brigadier General Humphrey Marshall. Unlike Garfield, who came from modest roots, Marshall came from a distinguished Kentucky family and was the son of a prominent Frankfort lawyer and the nephew of Chief Justice John Marshall. He graduated from West Point in 1832 and served with the U.S. Mounted Rangers during the Black Hawk War. He later became a lawyer in Louisville before once again taking up arms and serving as a colonel in the Mexican-American War. He won the distinction of leading a gallant cavalry charge at the Battle of Buena Vista. Later, he served as a United States Congressman and was President Millard Fillmore's commissioner to China. When the Civil War broke out, Marshall raised up a large number of troops for the Confederate Army and was made a brigadier general. After his defeat at the Battle of Middle Creek, many wondered if he was a capable leader, and he was never again given what he felt was a suitable command. In November 1863, he was elected to the Confederate Congress and worked as a lawyer in Louisville after the war. As we discussed earlier, John S. Cerro Gordo Williams was a hero of the Mexican War, and he was important to organizing recruits in eastern Kentucky and took part in the battles in the fall of 1861. After the Battle of Middle Creek, Williams was promoted to Brigadier General and placed in command of the Department of Southwestern Virginia. In 1863, he commanded a cavalry brigade which contested the advance of Burnside's corps into eastern Tennessee. He also played a key role at the Confederate victory in the First Battle of Saltville. Confederate Captain Ezekiel F. Clay was the son of United States Congressman Brutus J. Clay, a prominent Bourbon County stockbreeder and president of the Kentucky Agricultural Association. He was also the nephew of the fierce abolitionist Cassius Marcellus Clay, who was Lincoln's minister to Russia. How interesting it is that Captain Clay fought for the Confederacy while being the nephew of one of the most well-known abolitionists around. Clay organized a company of volunteers in Bourbon County and brought them to the Samuel May Farm, as we discussed earlier. He and his men participated in the Battle of Ivy Mountain. After the Battle of Middle Creek, he served with General Marshall's Army of Southwestern Virginia until the spring of 1863, when he and his men were transferred to Georgia to serve under General Nathaniel Bedford Forrest. He and his men rode with Wheeler's cavalry on their raid through Middle Tennessee. At Shelbyville, Clay was wounded but was healed in time to take part in the Knoxville campaign. In April 1864, he led a brigade of cavalry on a raid into eastern Kentucky, and at Puncheon Creek, he was defeated and badly wounded in the eye. He was sent to a POW camp on Johnson's Island near Sandusky, Ohio, and stayed there until the end of the war. After the war, he returned to the family farm in Bourbon County, Kentucky, known as Runnymede, and built it into one of the finest Kentucky thoroughbred farms in the world. Lieutenant Colonel George W. Monroe was born in Adair County, Kentucky, but grew up in Frankfort, where his father was a prominent judge. Monroe first saw combat at the Battle of Middle Creek, and as we mentioned above, he was the one who led the charge up the steep hills against the rebel sharpshooters, and that action likely won the battle for the North. Monroe and his men seen plenty of combat after the Battle of Middle Creek, including serving under General Sherman's command during the expedition to Chickasaw Bayou, Mississippi, in December of 1862, where he was wounded. Soon he was promoted to colonel and led an unsuccessful charge at Chickasaw Bluffs on the Yazoo River above Vicksburg, Mississippi. On March 18, 1865, Abraham Lincoln himself promoted Monroe to Brigadier General for his gallant and meritorious services during the war, and for the Union cause. Major Don A. Pardee was born in Wadsworth, Ohio, and trained at the United States Naval Academy. He played a key role in the Battle of Middle Creek by leading the main assault. After the battle, he fought in the Battle of Pound Gap, in which his leadership earned him a promotion to lieutenant colonel. He later fought in the battles of Rogers Gap, Chickasaw Bayou, and Port Gibson. He was eventually promoted to Brevet Brigadier General and practiced law in New Orleans after the war. Later, his former commander, President James Garfield, appointed Pardee to the United States Circuit Court for the 5th District, and he served on the United States courts until his death in 1919. Lieutenant Colonel Lionel A. Sheldon was born in Worcester, New York, but at a young age his parents moved to LaGrange, Ohio. He graduated from Oberlin College and later law school in New York. Before the war, he served as a brigadier general in the Ohio Militia, and then later, at the beginning of the Civil War, he was made a Union Army lieutenant colonel after raising 6 companies of men in only 6 days. That's some serious recruiting. Shortly after the Battle of Middle Creek, Sheldon was promoted to colonel and second in command to Garfield. His unit saw action under Sherman at Chickasaw Bayou and Cumberland Gap. Later, he and his unit fought under Major General Ulysses S. Grant at Port Gibson and Thompson's Hill, where he was wounded in the hand by a musket ball. He was healed enough to fight at the Battle of Vicksburg. After Vicksburg, he spent the rest of the war building forts and repairing levees. He was eventually promoted to Brevet Brigadier General, and after the war practiced law in New Orleans. Sheldon remained friends with James Garfield, and shortly after Garfield took the office of president, Sheldon took the office as Territorial Governor of New Mexico. In 1888, he moved to Los Angeles and practiced law, and eventually moved to Pasadena, California, until his death in 1917. Lieutenant George W. Gallup was born in Auburn, New York, but moved to Ohio and eventually Louisa, Kentucky, where he practiced law. When the 14th Kentucky Infantry was formed, he originally enlisted as a private, but after helping with the recruitment of men for his unit, he was promoted to quartermaster and the rank of first lieutenant. A few months after the Battle of Middle Creek, Gallup was promoted to lieutenant colonel and later colonel, and was made the commander of the 14th Kentucky. That's right, he was then the commander of the unit that he had joined as a private. From August 1863 to May 1864, he served as the commander of the military district of Eastern Kentucky. He was ordered to serve under General Sherman in the Atlanta campaign. After fighting in Atlanta, he reported back to his position of military commander of the military district of Eastern Kentucky and was promoted to Brevet Brigadier General. He was one of the few men that went from private to general during the Civil War. Now let's talk about what happened after the Battle of Middle Creek. The victorious Union Army occupied Prestonsburg, and Garfield set up his command in the Burns House, which was built in 1857 by Prestonsburg attorney John M. Burns. The house had a strategic position facing the Lavisa Fork of the Big Sandy. Burns had served in the Kentucky State Legislature and as a circuit judge. Burns supported the Union, which was interesting because he was a law partner with John M. Eliot, who was one of the area's most known secessionists and had served in the United States Congress in the 1850s. Eliot served in the Confederate Army as a recruiting officer in the area before serving in the Confederate Congress. Even though Burns was a supporter of the Union, after the Battle of Middle Creek, he felt that he should flee to Louisa because he feared that his association with Eliot would cause him to be arrested. Burns was forced to leave behind his wife Keziah, who was too sick to travel. And he also left his son Roland behind to take care of his mother. On the night of the Union victory after the Battle of Middle Creek, and before Garfield arrived on the scene, Union soldiers broke into the house and stole Mrs. Burns's gold watch and $17 in gold and silver coins. Most of the people in Prestonsburg supported the South and the Union troops found almost all the houses and barns had been stripped of provisions. Later that night, Roland and his friend carried Keziah on a mattress down to the river, where they loaded her on a flatboat and poled her all the way to Louisa. Keziah survived and stayed the remainder of the war in Catlettsburg, where her husband practiced law. Soon after the Burns family fled Prestonsburg, Colonel Garfield arrived and made the home his temporary headquarters for the next 10 days. The Union troops set up tents all around the house, which later became known as Garfield's Addition. From the time of Garfield's occupation of the house until its destruction, the house became known as Garfield Place. The house changed hands several times until 1895, Maggie Leet purchased the house for $450. Miss Leet restored the house and turned it into a Prestonsburg showplace. The Leets held colonial teas, complete with powdered wigs and colonial dress. The house also became Floyd County's first museum. In 1932, Congressman James R. Garfield, the son of President Garfield, came and toured the house. He was shown an old cap and ball pistol that a carpenter had found behind a plastered wall. The congressman said that it was likely his father's because he was very fond of that type of weapon. In the 1960s, the house was the stage for a drama called The Proud Heritage, which was about Prestonsburg during the Civil War. The house passed hands several more times within the family and was occupied until 1977. Sadly, the house was demolished in 1982. In 1916, 54 years after the Battle of Middle Creek, Floyd County Civil War veterans gathered on the steps of the Bank of Josephine for a reunion and to have their picture taken. Can you imagine the stories that these men shared? I wonder if any of them still held animosities towards each other. Today, the battlefield where the Battle of Middle Creek took place is a park, and it's led by the Middle Creek National Battlefield Foundation, Inc. And they have many plans for the future of the park, including a visitor center, a library, and a multimedia theater. Here at the park, there are several historic signs explaining much of the history of the battle. A statue of Abraham Lincoln seated in a chair, similar to the one in the Lincoln Monument, is on one side of the parking lot at a picturesque location between the gap and the ridgelines. There are two walking trails, one Confederate and one Union. Along each trail, you will find interpretive signs explaining many things about the battle and the history leading up to it. The park is free, open daylight hours, and well worth a visit. The Battle of Middle Creek is one of those lesser-known battles of the Civil War that doesn't get the attention that it probably should. The battle happened very early in the war, and I often wonder if local folks thought it would be one of the major battles fought. At the time of the battle, in January of 1862, no one could imagine the awful 3.5 years that were to come. After the battle here, the fighting in Kentucky was far from over, with dozens of battles, skirmishes, and raids still to come. However, this battle remains important because the Confederacy never again had as much of a foothold in Kentucky as they did before this battle, and that makes it a pivotal and important event. Let us know your thoughts about the battle in the comments below. And remember, family tree nuts, let our nuts find the nuts in your family tree.